Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. My name is Colin Moriarty. Today I'm joined by a very special group indeed. Of course, you recognize one of these faces if you've listened and watched Sacred Symbols Plus, listened to and watched Sacred Symbols Plus. Sandeep Rai, all the way from the UK. It's what, 10 o'clock right now?
Yes, 10 o'clock here, 10 p.m.
I'm sorry about that. But thank you
Kids are in bed.
thank you for taking the time. How are you, my friend? Good to see you.
Thanks, Colin.
How's life? How's everything going?
Yeah, really good. Obviously, lots going on, which is good. I like to be busy, but everything's really good.
Yeah, I don't know how you do it all, to be perfectly honest. We get into that every time I talk to you. And the face you might not recognize, but you will definitely recognize the Twitter account, the Substack, the Instagram account, wherever you are. It's Obsolete Sony. It's Eddie from Obsolete Sony. I didn't even know his name or knew what he looked like until he appeared on this very call. And I must admit to you, Eddie, and you know this because I've reached out to you several times, you are one of my white whales. You know, like I've been chasing you for a little while. I usually only ask people once or twice and I get it. You know, people shrug me off. That's totally fine. But I'm like, this guy knows so fucking much about Sony and is so connected to the company far beyond me that I had to have you on. And I'm so glad you're finally here. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Colin. It's great to be here and finally show my face to the world.
Yeah.
I think this is the first time that I ever participate in any kind of interview or call or anything like that. But I'm glad you're the first one to have me on. And hopefully I can tell you a bit about my story and how I got to Obsolete Sony.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, you're very welcome here. Our audience definitely knows who you are. I've recommended you many times to our audience. I love your Twitter account. I learned so much from it. And I think I said this to you in one of the letters, and it was something like on a social media feed that is so fucked. You know, like you have just a delightful, informative, interesting post for people like us. So welcome to the show. And Sandeep, welcome back. Like I said, now you guys are on here together for a specific reason because, you know, the audience knows Sandeep is a prolific now Kickstarter of self-published books. And I have them. I have the most recent issue of RPM right here, Retro PlayStation Magazine, Killzone issue. You're doing a great job with this. People are loving this. You've done the Vita books, the hardcovers, all the rest. There are PDFs out there. So you guys together launched a new Kickstarter called Sony Year by Year, A Visual Journey. Obsolete Sony, that's Eddie and Sandeep doing this together. At the time of recording, you're almost funded. I imagine you're going to be funded by the time this goes live, but certainly if you needed even a little bit of a push, the audience here is going to push you guys over. So many congratulations ahead of time for your guys' success.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sandeep, let's start with you.
Sure.
How did you make this connection? How did you break down the wall? I wasn't able to do it. You have that entrepreneurial spirit. You know, you are very successful in your space. I have no idea how you find the time, not only to do all this stuff, but to work your life. You have a family and a job. You remind me of how intrinsically lazy I am, even if I think that I'm actually a hard worker. You're just killing it out there. So how did you guys find each other? What's going on here?
So it was linked to RPM. So I mean, I'd been following Eddie from as soon as kind of like, you know, really early on when he created Obsolete Sony, and I just love the account as you know, Eddie. And I was doing RPM, and you know, it's all about retro PlayStation. And one of Eddie's posts really caught my eye. It was this. It was the PlayStation TV. You know, the gray one with the two little speakers on the sides. And so I thought, you know what? This guy just knows so much. So I just reached out to him and said, look, you know, I do this magazine, RPM. Would you be interested in just kind of like writing for it now and again and just like short 200 words, just article on these kind of like really weird tech that nobody would know about or seen before. And Eddie replied and said, yeah, he'd love to. So I kind of started from there where we just started talking and just working together. And then it was probably just a few months ago and you know, I can't take any credit for this because Eddie had already thought about a book before and like he'd already started making notes and started working on it. But I reached out to him and said, look, I've got all this experience in publishing. Have you thought about this? Do you want to work together? And he said yes. And they kind of went from there.
It's awesome. I love that. I love two like-minded people finding each other. And I think you guys are going to do very well together. So I think it's going to be a great marriage between you two. All right, Eddie, let's go to you. Um, so tell me about yourself. Like, who are you? Where do you live? I don't know how deep you want to get, but I'm like, I don't know anything. I don't know I don't know anything about you. So who are you? Where are you? Where are you right now? I
originally from Argentina.
Okay.
I live in Argentina. I was born here. I lived in the States for over 10 years. I moved back recently. I worked in the software industry for over 10 years. I got burned out, decided to take some time off and just dive into my real passion, that it's history of technology. And I'm very knowledgeable about many brands, but there's something about Sony, the rich history, the profound influence, that, and obviously the endless material to explore, that just made me decide that that was the brand that I was going to start with. I grew up with Sony. I don't know if I know about. We all had a PlayStation. I think, like, if you grew up during the 90s, more than likely you were a Nintendo kid or a Sony kid, a PlayStation kid. I was both. I was lucky. But I was always into retro gaming. I was collecting retro games and physical media. Around 2015, there was this nostalgia boom online, and people wanted to reconnect with, like, the sort of like what makes you comfortable. Nostalgia makes us all very comfortable. We can all connect to our memories. And for me, it was, I think I started collecting. I try to get all the physical versions of Star Wars. Trying to get all the VHS tapes from, obviously, from the States, from Europe, Japan, Laserdisc. Anyway, I even got the 8mm version. And I was like, now I need to get, like, the devices to play this stuff on. And slowly I started researching. And the more you research, the more you realize that something has kind of like been lost in technology. There's a lot of stuff that is fading into obscurity. And I was just like, I need to share this somehow. I started the account for myself, trying to save part of my research. I was just sharing snippets of it, and I was keeping most of it for myself. I made this huge archive. I think I got to over 1,000 Sony products. And then as soon as I started sharing stuff, the reception was great. So it just grew from there, and I got more into it, and now it turned into a book, which is amazing. What we were able to do with all the material that I've been gathering. Now it's been 2 years. I've been doing this full time for 2 years, just a solid 4 to 8 hours a day just for research. I know it might sound crazy for most people just to devote so much energy, but for me, I knew I was taking a break from work, and this is what I wanted to do.
That's awesome. I love it. And there is like a je ne sais quoi about Sony. And I think we all kind of know it. I'm like you, Eddie, where I grew up a kind of a Nintendo and a Sony person at the same time. I was a huge Nintendo fanboy, but I loved PlayStation from the beginning, especially because I love JRPGs. So that was a great machine. The jump off specifically from the SNES to the PS1 was perfect. But there was something as a kid that was so attractive about Sony. Sandeep, you must feel the same, right? Like when I bought my first computer, well, my parents bought it for me because it was late 1996. I got a Sony Vaio, which I'm pretty sure was one of the first, if not the first Sony Vaios. It was October or November 1996. It was $3,200 at Circuit City.
Wow.
And we bought it because we were like, oh, this must be we were looking at like an NEC and a few other things, and this was like seemed like it was more future proof. It's hysterical when you think about it. I think it had 128 megs of RAM and 1.8 gigs of memory or something like that. And I still have it in my dad's basement. It's one of the ones where it's all solid on the front, and then you press in and the slide comes down and you see all the disk drives and everything. It's so wonderful. And that made me feel like there's something special about this brand, so that when I bought my first TV a few years later, which I saved up for myself, it was 2000. I bought a Sony Trinitron. And then of course, PS1, PS2, all these things. There's something attractive. Were you attracted to the brand like that, Sandeep, outside of PlayStation as well? Like, so, it felt like it was the boutique, really nice brand. I don't know if people
100%.
still feel that way about it, but it felt that way when I was a kid.
Yeah, 100%. I remember I wanted a Sony Walkman, but my parents got me like this cheap, I think it was like Alba, like this really kind of rubbishy cheap kind of Chinese brand instead, because it was just too expensive. But I remember getting actually the Sony cassettes. You know, there's like the Sony metal cassettes. Don't know if you guys remember, like it was just kind of more high quality. And I just remember like me and my friends just were all obsessive over kind of the Sony, kind of the best sound quality and like mini discs. Loved it. And my first TV as well, that was a Sony kind of Bravia HD flat screen. That was the first time I had a flat screen, or anyone in my whole family actually. Me and my cousin got it at the same time, the same one. But Sony has always been like the premier brand for us.
It's funny, man. Mini disc was around when I was in middle school and high school, but when I finally, and it was lingering. When I finally got to college, I bought one, and I had no idea. I must admit, I had no idea how to use it. Like I could not get it to work on my computer, and I just brought it back. You know, I was like, oh, this is already getting too sophisticated for me. Eddie, I love what you're saying about the research and all this, and I get it because by trade, I guess I went to college for American history, and I love researching and I love looking things up, and I worked in an historical society and transcribed documents, and I just love that shit. So I totally connect with you. What are some of the tools that you're using to research in this space to find this stuff? Because if people ask about American history, it's like, oh, you got to use JSTOR and you got to use all these things. Like what are you using to find these amazing images, this amazing information?
You know, one of the great things about Sony is that they keep their own websites, especially for the computer line. But they do that for a lot of products. Those websites that they put up 20 years ago, some of them are still up. And there's a weekly flyer that Sony put out for, they don't do it anymore, but they stopped doing it recently. But from the late 50s up until the early 2000s, there are 1,000 flyers with products, sort of like, you know, that little booklet that you get with a newspaper from Best Buy.
Right. Like circulars.
Yeah, that stuff. Obviously, archive.org has a lot of material. It's just, you need to really dig for it. And there's a lot of stuff that I still don't have information about. There's a very obscure early 70s video game machine prototype that nobody really knows. Nobody has any information on it, not even Sony does. So
interesting.
There's a few pieces like that that I can say that they got completely lost. And just in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of stuff getting lost too. Websites that don't work anymore. So for me, it was a preservation effort, in part because I can tell that if we keep waiting another 5 to 10 years, most of this knowledge is going to just be lost. But,
let me ask. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask, like, I'm obviously I consider myself a brand expert in PlayStation, but I honestly know very little about outside Sony. Like, I really don't. And I know this more. I started covering Sony almost 20 years ago, and PlayStation, and at that point, it became a very monocultural company that's really dominated by PlayStation, and it's got pictures and music and all the rest. Mm-hmm. But I know the company has a much deeper history. And what I find so remarkable about your work and what's really brought to the fore for me is that Sony was making so much shit and somehow selling it and making money on all of this stuff. And now they don't make anything really, very few things comparably.
They do. It's just that it's not the same. There were a lot of strategic errors. It lost its edge for sure. We can all agree it lost. There was something that got lost. But the entire fragmented strategy for their products, where most companies like Apple were trying to create systems that will work with each other better. Sony completely failed at that. There's obviously what they're doing now with the PlayStation brand. It's great, but for I would say the time from the early 2000s up until the end of the PlayStation 3 era, there's a lot of segmentation and things don't really work with each other, and everything's like confusing. Just the model numbers are confusing. I've been going through these models for years now, and sometimes I still get confused about why they suddenly changed these or that. But they still have great products. Like their TVs in the over $2,500 segment are the best ones. Cameras, up until recently, every iPhone had a Sony sensor in it. It's just that they won't compete with the rest of the brands in the more. I guess they gave up on that, on the idea of trying to compete for like the $400 TVs or that stuff. At least for now, we don't know. I mean, the company keeps evolving. It's been over 70 years, and they're probably going to be around for a long time. And there's always a chance that at some point they might change their strategy. But their current business strategy is all focused around PlayStation.
It's it seems that way. And I know not really being familiar with their financials before maybe the mid 90s, it seems like being more monocultural is a little more dangerous. But it is fascinating to think that, like, again, just going through all your images and all the information you put out there, it's like, wow, man, like they were just making everything and they had such a visual eye. What's that all about? What is it? What is the secret sauce, do you think, with that early to mid Sony about just the visual flair and kind of being there ahead of time and being such a forward-looking company? There's something so remarkable about it to me.
I don't know. It's something that I recently was able to talk to some people that it's working in the industry in big companies, and they still ask me the same thing. Like, what do you think was that they had that got lost? I think that in one hand, they were very quick in their iterations. They were, for example, things like minidisc the minidisc was developed in a 6-month period. The first Walkman was developed in a 2-month period. A lot of this stuff was just going from simple concept into a product in weeks. There was really, and obviously that came with a lot of problems too, right? There was a lot of stuff that consumers didn't like. Like the minidisc, for example, was a complete failure for the company. They released this $700 device thinking that it was going to replace Walkmans when Walkmans were already below $100. So it made no sense. Mm-hmm. It would be like trying to replace the PlayStation with something that it's over $3,000 now or something like that. But definitely all the brands back then, all the Japanese brands at least, were very into making designs as industrial as possible. They were not afraid of adding buttons and adding materials and making things heavy. Um, but yeah, it's something that I'm still fascinated because I collect these items and I get to play with them, and there's just something that I feel we are never gonna get again. That golden era that started in the late '70s and ended around the late '90s. Um, those products were completely different to what we have now and what we're probably going to get in the next 20 years.
Yeah, there's something we talk about it on our show a lot, especially about the PlayStation designs early on. The original PlayStation looks like a video game console, and I understand that, and it is. But the PS2 was, to me, such a triumph from my layman eyes of industrial design, where I'm like, this thing is perfect. And I look at the PS5 now, like I just took my Pro, I bought the Pro and took it out, and I'm like, man, this thing looks like I bought it on Temu. There's like, why, like what happened? I look at the PS4 and the PS4 Pro, perfect looking, especially the Pro, how it's just like another stack and it otherwise looks the same. Beautiful. I look at the PS5 and I'm like, I don't get it.
Especially those little plastic feet now on the Pro.
Right. It's very cheap.
I hate it. Yeah.
Yeah. It just feels very cheap, and it just feels very like as a kid, my dad I don't know if you guys are familiar. Do you guys know what Consumer Reports is? It's like a big magazine in the United States. And my dad's obsessed with that, like for my entire life. And I'm 40 now. So I used to like pick through them, and maybe it speaks to like the little bit of the autism of my brain or something, where I just love rankings and statistics and stuff. So even though I didn't know anything about cars or anything about, I would always look at like, oh, what's the nicest TV in like 1994 when I'm 10 years old. And you just see Sony and Sony and Sony. And then like you say, it kind of does fall off at that point. Then LG and Samsung and all these things kind of start coming to the fore. But I look at these old pictures on Obsolete Sony, and I'm like, man, they were just nailing the design time after time after time, and then they just kind of lost it. Or maybe like you said, maybe there's some things certainly I don't know about, but in terms of their mass market design machine like the PS5, I'm like, man, you don't even care what this thing looks like, obviously, because we don't use the Xbox Series X, to be perfectly honest with you, almost ever, but it sits next to it, and I'm like, that looks way better than the PlayStation 5, in my opinion. Let me ask you this, Eddie. What are some of the pioneering items that Sony, like that people should know that Sony was either the fundamental first designer of, or someone that revolutionized a particular product? Like what comes to mind for you? The few things that Sony is really like a revolutionary company.
It's everything. Sony was the first company to put out anything and everything that was tape. That used like the System G, for example. I'm sorry, not the System G. Do you know about the System G?
No, I don't, but I'll look it up. Yeah.
The System G was the first. It was created for special effects. It was when the company finally started transitioning from 2D effects to 3D effects for post-production in the broadcasting industry. And it's funny, I don't know why I say System G, but the System G is basically the PlayStation. That was the machine that was around $100,000 to $150,000 in 1991. And that's what got the attention of Ken Kutaragi initially. That's when he had the realization that 3D was going to be possible at least in the next 5 to 6 years. So he knew that it was going to be impossible to get from $100,000 to $300 for a very price-sensitive market like the video game market. But he knew that if he somehow waited around and established himself within the company, he was going to be able to get the price down to something that could eventually compete with Nintendo. So that's a lot of people don't. I've been trying to track a System G. There's a few units, but you can imagine it's basically like a CPU, like a large box with a trackball and some video inputs,
Yep.
and you could just.
I'm
You
looking
found
at.
it?
I'm looking at. Yeah, well, I found it. I was just gonna. I was gonna let you finish because I didn't want to interrupt you. Just to say, like, when I searched for it, you came up first.
Oh yeah,
A tweet
I
about
mean,
it, and
obsessed.
there's something. I don't know if this resonates with you guys, but there's something. This is awesome because like there's a flyer here, like you said, and it's 1989, and there's something
Yeah.
eerie about looking at 3D graphics from 1989. Like it's how I feel about that original Pixar film, that short film, where like they're just making it up, and there's something unholy about it in some sense because like no one really know. And it's how I feel about looking at this, where I'm like, this is so.
Well, imagine back then, I guess the system that most TV stations were using was called the Mirage, and it was the size. It took an entire room, and it was like $1 million.
Interesting.
And you can still see some demo reels on YouTube for it, but it was very basic 3D, like what we could probably now do with, I don't know, anything. And so they went from, Sony was able to miniaturize that from taking an entire room to, they were able to fit it in a box. And that was like around the mid 80s. That's when Ken Kutaragi got to see it for the first time. It wasn't released until 1991. And then 5 years later, it was the PlayStation for
so
$300.
It's so interesting. It's so fascinating. Well, since we're in that period of late 80s, early 90s, it is a very trite question, but you must know more about it than anyone.
Yeah.
What is the Nintendo PlayStation thing? Do we really understand all the facts about that? Like as is commonly known, like there's nothing interesting that to be said about that anymore, really.
I wrote 20,000 words on it. Someday I'll do something with it. Do you want to know the whole story?
Yeah, I mean, if you have time, okay. I love stories. Yeah.
So basically, after Ken found the System G, he was shown the System G internally in a room. He got obsessed with it, and he figured that at that point he was just another engineer at Sony. He needed to establish himself within the company to get more influence because he wanted for the company to get into video games. So the first thing that he did was he got in touch with the people at Nintendo to work on their sound chip for the Super Famicom, the Super Nintendo. So he closed that deal with Nintendo, and pretty much every Super Nintendo has that Sony audio chip in them. That's how he was trying to get his foot in with Nintendo somehow. So he did that. And then he started pushing for Sony to see if there was, at that point, you got to situate yourself like around the late 80s, early 90s. They were still working with Philips because they developed the CD-ROM. And they were really thinking about how a CD-ROM unit was going to improve loading times for systems in general. Sony had their disk system, but it was super slow. They weren't even using the latest in floppy disk technology. So his idea was to see if he could convince Nintendo to use a CD-ROM provided by Sony as an external unit that will attach to the SNES. Initially, they did not want to. I mean, they completely reject the idea of working with Sony because you got to think that now Nintendo is huge, but back then they were still a small company, and Nintendo and Sony was huge, so they felt like they were going to get eaten by Sony in a couple of years. But he kept trying, and eventually they said yes. They started the development of that unit, the unit that surfaced around 2015 that we all seen the prototype. Um, that was shown around 1991. It was finished around. The good thing is that I have all those dates. Like I have their meetings, their dates, and everything. It's I written everything down. But yeah, what really happened is that my feeling after reading a lot of like Japanese books about it and going through a lot of interviews, even with Kutaragi, I think Kutaragi from the start did not want to work with Nintendo, and he did as much as possible to establish himself within Sony as the video game guy, and also sort of like giving Nintendo a deal that he knew that they were going to reject at some point. So when they finally decided not to go with Sony for their external drive, and they picked Philips, which is weird because that turned into the Philips CDI.
Right.
Was a total failure. But he went straight to Sony CEO and he explained what was going on, and somehow right there the CEO decided, okay, we're going to get into the video game market now. Like if Nintendo is willing to do this to us, then we're gonna go and kick their ass.
Yeah, and it ended up being, I mean, that Nintendo. I mean, I don't want to say Nintendo almost disappeared, but they were getting their ass kicked by Sony for a while before the Wii really helped turn it around. I mean, obviously the SNES was great, but not as, didn't sell as well as the NES, and N64 was down from there. I imagine Sony must have been mystified in some sense by I don't know if we would even know this, but there's got to be some sort of mystification about the direction Nintendo went in after that, where they kind of went more cartridge based, more expensive games, more difficult to manufacture. The horror stories you hear from developers about making games on not only SNES and Genesis, but N64 is crazy, because they're like, we would get 100,000 units of a game. And then it's like, sorry, EA gets 8 million cartridges this year and we need them all for EA Sports games. So Naughty Dog specifically, or the founders of Naughty Dog are specifically the ones that told me that for their Genesis game Rings of Power. And they were like, it was such a nightmare because when we finally got with PlayStation, we realized we could just make as many games as we wanted. It was like totally trivial to manufacture these CDs, So just from that alone, it must have been so strange. And Sony must have felt like they were in pretty good shape,
Yeah, they were very afraid of piracy, and they were very stuck into how the business was during the Famicom era. And, some of these Japanese companies are very structured and they really stick to like their process. And I think that's what happened to, and I think that the only reason why PlayStation went with CDs in the end, it was because to create PlayStation, they use a lot of guys from the music industry. And like PlayStation is not really a Japanese project. It's more like an American and Japanese project. So they were able to have the vision to see that things needed to change towards CDs. But yeah, it's very interesting that they, like, if you go through articles from around the era before the release of the Nintendo 64, every company was getting into CD-ROMs. They all knew it was the future, and a lot of announcements had been made about new consoles using CDs, and just Nintendo went ahead and used cartridges, and then they tried to release a failed CD-ROM unit a couple of years after their initial release.
I'm fascinated by, I mean, I was in both camps, so I was totally happy there. But even then as a kid, I felt it was annoying. Like, I'm 12, 13, 14 going and getting these games, and I go buy, Majora's Mask for $70, and then I buy whatever, Breath of Fire 3 for $50. Everything's $50 because of the manufacture cost, unless you have multiple CDs. I just loved that. That was very attractive to me. as a kid. I knew there was something wrong with it even then, and I was totally stupid about this stuff. So what else? What other kind of touchstones are there? We talked a little bit about. We've kind of touched on a few things, but like, what are some of the other major Sony touchstone inventions or whatever that should be known?
Things that I like that I always think about are, for example, the first PCM that came out in 1971, and this was the first digital recorder, audio digital recorder, the first machine that could convert analog signal into a digital signal before the invention of CDs. That back then Betamax was still fighting in the home video market, and they just released this little box that you could add to your Betamax and input your analog audio from your home recordings or whatever, and turn them into digital using the Betamax tapes. And this was like 1971, Colin.
It's amazing. It's amazing, man.
It's crazy. It's crazy because most people around that time had mostly vinyl, reel to reel, and cassettes were only like 6 years old. Like compact cassettes were only 6 years old. Now they're 60 years old.
It's crazy.
But yeah, it's crazy. HD TV in 1992. Like I have photos of them showing their first HD TV Trinitron capable television in 91, which is like crazy.
It's wild. It's wild.
Yeah.
You and I are similar, I think, and I'm sure you're like this too, Sandeep, where, and you guys are way more technical than me, but I'm just fascinated by old technologies and the things that people were doing with them when they had no business doing anything with them. Like, obviously, a really rote thing is something like the space program before the microprocessor even existed. It's like, how did you even do this? It's crazy how you even did any of this stuff. So yeah, you think about people watching films in their homes in the 70s, even the early 70s, and it's like, Jesus Christ, that is so far ahead of its time. It's like what by the 77, 78, you start hearing of like home video clubs and stuff, like the early video stores. And it's like, damn, dude, these guys were on the bleeding edge of that sort of thing. And it's amazing.
Yeah, vision. I get amazed pretty much every day with something that it's completely ahead of what most of the world was doing. Like, for example, let me think. HD, it blows my mind. Like 1991 HD. It's crazy.
Isn't there like HD footage from like the late 80s or early 90s? There's of New York City, right? And it's like, what the fuck? Because I lived in that time. I was young, but it's like, I remember this, and this is the way it really looked. And we don't have anything like that. We have all this grainy lost footage shit.
It's a very particular look that I love because there's still a lot of artifacts. It is HD. There's obviously more lines of resolution, but there's still some analog artifacts to it that you don't see. Like it looks weird just because it's a mix of. You can totally tell that it's an in-between technology that still has some of the look from the previous technology, but it also has a lot more resolution. I love it. There's one guy on YouTube that he's doing a great job saving those videos because back then that was only available in Japan through laser discs that were very expensive, and now I think they're even more expensive to get. So preserving that, it's a great. I think that there's 20 of those videos, and some clips from those videos you can find them on the original demos for the PlayStation.
Oh, interesting.
Like some of that stuff got into the PlayStation because they were just trying to show the video capabilities of it. Even though they don't support PlayStation, doesn't support video CD. Like only a very specific region of the first PlayStation used it. They were still, that old demo with the dinosaur that we all seen.
Yep.
There's still some HDVS videos there. A few seconds of them.
That's awesome. Sandeep, I'm sorry. I'm just picking something this man's brain. You know, I'm sorry. It's just like I have him captive. I need to keep picking his brain here. Well, I have a weird question. I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this question. I think you will know the answer to this question. It's something I've thought about. So I'm going to position it in a weird way, though. Have you either of you seen the show Mad Men by chance?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So okay. Well, it's not a spoiler, but there's a scene where a Japanese company comes over. I think it's Toyota or Honda or something like that, and they're not well received by. And this is probably like 63 or something, 64 in the show. Early on in the show. Did Sony have to overcome barriers in the West that were similar to what was shown in that? Like almost a racist, like, I know that was a little bit in the car industry. I don't know very much about it, but like Datsuns and all this kind of shit that was like early on where people just didn't trust it and they would make fun of it. And that's where like some racist terms like rice rocket and all that kind of stuff comes from, I think, you know. Did Sony have to overcome similar barriers being a Japanese company, especially working in the United States and in other Western countries? Or were they kind of just accepted and people were kind of over it even 20 years later?
By 1962, Akio Morita moved to the States. He loved the States. I think that he got to visit in the late 50s. And it was, you can read in some of the interviews what he said, and he said, everything's so big. There's so much space. And he loved the United States. So he moved his entire family. As soon as the portable radios started selling a lot, started competing in the States, and before they released their first portable TV, he moved his entire family to the United States. And in 1962, they opened their first showroom in New York. And when you look at photos from that time, you can see the Japanese flag in the store.
Interesting.
Like you can see the American and the Japanese flags together. So I think I don't have any stories about. There's probably some stories about some Americans not being great with a Japanese company, because we're still talking about very early in the early 60s. But the fact that they were able to do that and just have the Japanese flag over Fifth Avenue like that, and it may, I think that by then it was something that was accepted, and I think that the way that Sony works is like they hire people when they're moving into, this is something that I researched for the book, and there's an entire strategy of, as soon as you move into a new territory, you hire people from that territory. You make sure that you understand their culture, and you try to bring your knowledge, but you allow the people who's going to represent you in these new regions to tell you what to do and give you directions on what it's. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Instead of just
absolutely.
like walking into a new territory and trying to impose your whatever your business ideas are.
Absolutely. And it's PlayStation as a specific brand has been excellent at hiring local talent, especially in the UK early on. Yeah. And obviously that civil war that kind of happened during the PS4 era relocalized the company in California. And they have great talent there too. So I totally understand what you mean. And yeah, I'm so glad I was able to ask you that, because that was in my notes, and it's like such an obscure question that I don't think anyone would really know the answer to. And that's always stuck out to me from Mad Men, because when I was watching that, as a person with a great eye, in my opinion, towards American history, I'm like, yeah, I never really consider like when and how Japanese companies kind of reestablished themselves. And maybe the flag on Fifth Avenue was a sign of a new time, because it's not the rising sun flag, it's the new white and red flag, right? It's like it's got a new look, a new feel, a new generation. And that might have been very, that might have been great for people to see. I just always think of Roger Sterling in that scene, and I'm like, man, that's rough.
Yeah, I feel that there's like a Hollywood stereotype about the business people from Japan going into a meeting. I've seen that. There's also scenes like that in the show Suits.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
The one about the lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no, I feel that because they had so much love for the US, and the company was, initially the reason why Sony was able to do what they were able to do is because they went to the States and they acquired patents to work with transistors. That was in the mid to late 50s. So they really had this vision that they knew that they had to collaborate with people in the United States, and eventually I think the founder spent almost his entire life there. He was going back and forth to Japan every week, and he spent his later years in Hawaii.
Interesting. It's so fascinating. Man, I can pick your brain.
There's so much cutting. I know. I have a horrible memory. That's the thing about this is like I write down everything and I keep track of everything. But I don't. I like we start talking about things that I know I have a lot of information on. I just don't remember the. But there are a few stories about that specific time in the early 60s when Akio Morita was throwing parties at his house, inviting celebrities and politicians, trying to sell Sony to everyone. He really worked on trying to position the brand during those years. So yeah, like a lot of it, it's kind of like being lost now because that's I think Akio Morita has one book that it's made in Japan, and there's two or three more books in Japanese that kind of like tell you the story of his first years in the United States, and but those are super hard to get now.
It's amazing. It's funny because I was born in '84, so the world I came into, like Sony was an established entity that everyone respected, and there is so much to be told that I'm not familiar with, and like you said, is being lost to time. Sandeep, you had mentioned earlier, something was in the book. I do want to get back to the book to remind everyone about the book. One question I had for you, and you guys can both get into this if you want, but I think you'll have insight into this because of all the projects you've already done, is how much can you get away with showing? Like, do you have to get Sony's permission to do any of this stuff, to show logos? And I'm always curious about like how annoying they can be, because they don't seem, they're not. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
They have the right to get really annoying if they want. For us, it was more about using only official images. Like there are press images that they released over the years. They've been doing press images from the very beginning. What I really wanted to avoid, and we completely avoided, is using images from other creators. Like you're not gonna see your photo in our book,
right?
But we're pulling from everything that is official, everything that Sony released to promote the product. We're using some old ads, but I would say that 98% of the photos are the official product photos, and it's a shame because there's a lot of stuff that we're not able to include because there are no official photos, and we don't want to pull from any other creators. But yeah, I feel that they will be in their right if they will tell us, look, next time you gotta ask us to do this. It's just that realistically, to clear the amount of images that we should clear. I mean, how many photos we have, Sandeep? Like,
dude, like 800, probably
yeah,
close to 1,000 even. Yeah,
yeah.
knocking on that.
There's 1,000 official images that they will have to, and they don't love to promote their older stuff. Um, um, they some when you go through their official recaps, as they do once in a while, they leave a lot of stuff out. It's like only the most successful stuff makes it in, like the Walkman and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, we'll see if eventually we can work with them to get their official approval on this stuff. It will be amazing.
That would be awesome. Yeah, they don't. In my many years of covering them, like they're not a litigious company. They don't really go after anyone for anything. Like I'm surprised by the things people actually get away with, compared to Nintendo. That
if it's a fan project like what we're doing, we're aiming to do it as a small fan project. I think it's okay. Like if you try to make a book and sell it in stores, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't risk it.
Yeah, no, of course not. Of course not. Yeah, like when they sued more recently over filed a cease and desist over Bloodborne cart, which was like the most recent thing I remember them really doing. It was like, I feel like even those guys were just kind of being way too annoying and like overt with it. It's like, I think if you just quietly made that game and just kind of, it was a thing, I don't think they even would have bothered, as opposed to Nintendo going back and literally getting patents for things so that they can then go after people. It's very interesting, the different tacks that the companies take.
Yeah, you know how I can tell they don't really care? Because I recently, in the last 2 months, started selling some merchandise, like T-shirts.
I noticed that, yeah.
So I have to go through their trademark files. There's a website where you can check how many trademarks they have, and you can see everything. You can see from stuff they filed in the 60s up until, I don't know, Ghost of Tsushima, the sequel. And they abandoned a lot of stuff. Like the Walkman logo, the original Walkman logo hasn't been renewed. And it's weird because you would say like it's historic, and it will probably take them 5 minutes to renew that stuff. And they don't do it because they don't focus on the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. I spend a lot of time looking at their game trademarks, and they do move slowly and let things expire and then file new things. And they do seem to be a little latent. And a lot of that I suspect might even be from trying to avoid leaks or whatever. So they kind of go late on a lot of things because people like us are scraping the fucking USPTO on a constant basis, like a bunch of crazy people. All right. So I wanted to. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
I was just going to say one thing quite cool. So I don't know if you remember when I did the PS3 book, you asked about the same question about kind of, would I get in trouble with Sony because some of the logos. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned the designer we're using the same guy, Jason Madison, who's brilliant. He's excellent. He's always kind of looking for ways to tweak logos or create new versions. So the front cover of the book is not Sony's logo.
Yeah, we can use that.
Yeah, it's very similar, but it's not their actual logo. It's slightly elongated letters and stuff. So
interesting.
Yeah,
nice.
Yeah, that's kind of
well done.
He was thinking ahead to avoid a situation happening later.
And speaking of the logo, it's funny. One of the touchstone posts I think from Obsolete Sony was the whole logo change thing, which I thought was so fascinating about how they had a contest and then they're like, oh yeah, no, we'll just stick with it. And it's funny, like there is no, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think so. Like there's no singular representation of Sony. Like there's like not an image that says Sony. It's not like an N in a circle or something like Nintendo or whatever, the like weird things that you can identify other brands with, or the PS logo for PlayStation. It's like, it's just Sony and it just says it. And it is just so clean and iconic. And I'm so glad they didn't change it. We would probably look back at that moment and be like, oh my God, what have you done? They
made very small tweaks to it. Like there's 5 or 6 different versions but for us, if we will just look at it,
Mhm.
it looks the same, and it's been the same since the late 50s. Before that, there's a couple of different logos. They weren't really sure to the way they started using this Sony as a brand before they turned into Sony officially. They tested it for 6 months, I think. They were using it in billboards. Um, they called the first reel-to-reel tape, they called it the Sony tape, but it was with an I instead of a Y. So there was a transition very early, but then after, especially after they moved to America, they stick to the same logo forever. And
It's
I feel that 1982
mhm.
contest, I feel that was marketing. I don't think they were. Uh, I don't think they really had an intention of changing their logo.
Yeah,
Not back then.
and it might have been a thing too where it's like, yeah, we're not going to do it, but maybe someone presents us something we couldn't even believe, you know. But it's like, yeah, like even the things that they showed, I'm like, oh, it's not right. None of this is right, you know. All right, I'm going to let you guys go soon. I promise. I have two more things I want to
I'm good.
ask about before I do, and we'll of course re-promote the book and let everyone know where they can get it. I was curious if you guys wanted to speak to, and Eddie, if you want to speak to Sony's. So I guess beginning with CBS Music and then moving into Columbia and other acquisitions into PlayStation, obviously, that they became over time more of an entertainment or IP driven creative company. What's this? How do you understand that happening? To what end is that happening? And it's so fascinating. It's still happening today as they get more and more into that. In the most recent financials, they focus a great deal on the acquisition of the back catalogs of Pink Floyd, Michael Jackson, and others. So what's your take on that? And was that a
I
wise
honestly
move?
don't know what's going on with that stuff now, but I know that at some point they were focused on trying to grow, I guess, vertically or horizontally, just trying to
We
make
horizontally.
sure that they could have at least some properties that they could, because if you think about it, I don't know if you've seen, like recently I made an article for the newsletter where I went through like 50 movies showing product placement in movies.
No, I didn't see that. That sounds awesome though. I can get lost in that.
Like there's so much product placement, and it kind of like it peaked around the mid 2000s when it just became too much. But I started all the way back in I guess in the early 70s, showing like how Sony was like inserting their products in movies more and more. Um, I think that can be a reason why they might want to have a presence in the movie industry, just so they could make sure that they could showcase their products more. Um, but you got to think that Sony got into banking, into life insurance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like they when you have enough cash to do stuff, you start looking for other business units and other more things. I guess more things to invest on that eventually might like they were so into the thing. It's an entire chapter. The video home wars and how
like,
they.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that it's. I think that at that point they probably realized that they needed to have some influence within the movie industry,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of companies were fighting home video. Like Disney, for example, was really fighting. They did not want to release their movies in home video. Same thing happened when they tried to release that tapes, digital audio tapes. So maybe, I don't know, because this is something that I honestly haven't researched much, but just making this connection, I think that they probably felt that they needed to have their foot within these industries to make it a little bit easier for them to not get sued immediately when they were trying to release a new technology that was probably going to um, change the landscape somehow.
Yeah,
It could be that too.
it's like that came to fruition, I guess, later on, even with Blu-ray, kind of allowing them to kind of push that technology.
Yeah, that's a great example of how they were able to use that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about them getting into if you look at it intuitively, they actually did PlayStation differently. Like you can imagine a world where they maybe early on were like, maybe we could buy Nintendo, in like 1986 or something. Because they were like, we want to be in music. So they bought CBS Music, and then they're like, we want to be a movie. So they bought Columbia. And
Yeah.
And everything stayed the same. Now it just says like a Sony company underneath the Columbia lady, and all that kind of stuff. And nothing really changes. And so PlayStation in and of itself is so interesting because they really did kind of do it from the ground up. But I think that's because they had the technology background that the other things require, like nice cameras and good audio equipment, all of that, but it's not the same. So it's interesting to think about the way they went about things.
So many failed things. For example, Darning, you mentioned that you had a PCG 505, the first Vaio.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers of it, but yeah, I mean it's that purple. Like it's amazing.
Well, the 505 was the one of the early ones, if not the first one. I think it was the first one. Those were Windows machines that then Vaio was created after meetings that took place between Sony and the guy that was running Intel. They created this strategic partnership for Sony to start acquiring Intel processors for what it was going to be their new computer line. They had the MSX computers in the 80s that were kind of like a failure, so they stayed away from that. But around the mid 90s, they decided, and with the internet, they felt that it was computers were going to be a consumer product. And after they got in conversations with Intel, they released their first notebook computer. And just two or 3 years after that, they were very close to start using Mac OS in Vaio computers. There's a story about Steve Jobs going into a meeting and showing them I don't know if it was a meeting or if it was during a business trip I think it was a business trip in Hawaii. He kind of like ambushed the Sony executives to show them that he had a Vaio computer running Mac OS. And by then they were already, they did not want Mac OS. I mean, there were some things that made it impossible for them to change to Mac OS. Those computers were running Windows, and they run Windows. They always run Windows for the entirety of the Vaio line. But yeah, you can only fantasize how things could have changed if Sony started building computers using the Apple operating system.
Yeah, because that was during and I only know this from all those nerdy YouTube channels I watch, like I was saying earlier, but like the era of the Apple clone, that there were like actually a bunch of Apple eventually relented and were like, okay, we'll let other people make Macs.
Yeah.
And so they did have that mentality. It's so interesting to think that they actually did that for a while. It's almost lost to history because like that's like the antithesis of Apple now.
Yeah.
Totally closed up. It's so interesting. It's I can pick your brain forever.
There's another story about Microsoft going. There were like 2 or 3 secret meetings between Microsoft and Sony before the release of the first Xbox, with the idea of working together on a system. It was similar to what I don't want to talk too much about this because I don't have these 100%. There's probably somebody who's going to be like, I have the story, but yeah, you read about all these weird stories, like it makes you think about all these weird what ifs. But there were definitely meetings between Sony and Microsoft before the first Xbox.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I always it just scratches something into me that I've been telling my audience for years. Sandy's probably heard me talk about it. People like don't believe it, is like the level that these companies behind the scenes, even if they're rivals, do talk to each other and try to work things out. And the thing I always bring up is, and people don't believe it, but I literally know someone who was in the room who told me the story that back like when the PS4 was launching, that Sony and Microsoft were talking about bringing Master Chief Collection to PS4. And that was like a high level talk or whatever. And people just don't believe it. It's like, yeah, even these rivals, these staunch competitors will talk to each other and make nice with each other if they have to. Although I think Microsoft and Sony it doesn't seem very friendly between them these days after the FTC stuff, and Sony really just trying to throw a wrench in it to just make it more difficult for no reason other than to just make it more difficult, really, knowing that it really wasn't probably going to affect them too deeply. The final question I wanted to ask you, Eddie, and then we'll go, is about your collection. It sounds like you have an amazing array of items. And I say,
not really.
No, you don't. I mean,
not after you get to see some Japanese collections.
Oh, so there's like some serious Sony collectors out there that even.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, I what I do is I'm very conscious about space. There's only so much you can get before you run out of space.
Right.
So from the start, I always felt that I needed to have. I curated these setups for each era, right? For video games, for example, like I have a like a small CRT with a PlayStation 1, a VCR, an audio system from that specific era. Like everything matches, everything is like correct in terms of like the years. Then I do the same for PS2, where I have my PS2, the first one of the very early LCDs, and a CRT. Like an early 2000s CRT when they got flat. And then I got the PlayStation 3 with the 3D monitor they release, and I keep that. Obviously, I have a couple of Walkmans, couple of Discman. Like I have the first Discman, the first Walkman, a mini disc, but I still don't have the first one. Yeah, I have like the oldest thing that I have is a 1968 recorder, still in the box.
Oh wow, that's sick.
Like I can show you one that I have right here. Like,
oh wait, there you are. There.
This is a 1972 TV.
Okay. Sorry, we had a little technical snafu there. I'll have Dustin edit it in some sort of sophisticated way to make it seem like nothing happened, and you probably wouldn't have noticed that if I didn't say anything. But now I did, so now you're going to notice. And ironically, we were having the technical issue at the time when we were using visuals for the first time. So just a little piece of irony, I guess. All right. I've taken enough of your guys' time. I want to say this at the top before I even get into the book. Okay. You both are very impressive people. If you ever want to do more stuff on the history of Sony and are looking for like production assets or funding or whatever, you should talk to me, because I feel like there's something here that's it's fucking sick coffee table book, something to rip through. But this kind of stuff is hard to do. I know it, and so if someone's doing it, then it should be propagated as much as possible. And people love brand histories, and everyone obsesses over the same companies, in the game space. And I understand it, like Nintendo, it's a fascinating company. Everyone loves the hit, and PlayStation is a brand, but not Sony. This is the first I've ever seen any of this stuff. And I'm like really in this world. So I can imagine that a lot of people are the same. So I wanted to say that at the top before we even get into the Kickstarter, is that if you ever want to do more projects and you're looking for someone to partner with, you should talk to me for sure. Cause like you guys are very impressive people.
Thank you, Colin. I have so many plans, so many ideas. I'm an ideas guy. I'm always thinking, like I want to get into documentaries. I want to get into fiction. There's so much. There's such a rich history to explore. But the one thing that I value the most is making these connections and being able to do this with other people and sharing as much as possible of it. It's great. And hopefully, well, you will see us again with more projects and more stories, because we love this stuff.
Yeah, I do too. And you guys are very welcome here anytime. Sandeep, you already know that.
Thanks, man.
You guys are very welcome here to pitch your wares. It's quite the meeting of the minds for you two, in my opinion, because it's like Sandeep's a known quantity who's produced and really produced results on things that people like, and they come back over and over again. I got the email when the Obsolete Sony book launched, Sandeep Rye is launching another Kickstarter. People are seeing that sort of thing. And so having that entrepreneurial marketing kind of angle, and then the person who's doing the deep dive, really difficult research above and beyond the difficult work Sandeep already does by writing and editing and doing all that kind of stuff. It's like, I have no idea how you even operate, actually. So I love this meeting of people. I think this is good stuff. And so I wanted to congratulate you guys on that, first of all, because this is obviously going to be awesome. All right. So Sandeep, let's go to you and let's use your marketing and pitch skills here. Talk to us about the Kickstarter for Sony Year by Year, A Visual Journey by Obsolete Sony. That's gone up like $1,000, I think, since we even started recording this, to be perfectly honest with you. So, because it's at almost 24 now, I think.
Nice.
USD anyway. It probably shows in pounds for you guys, or for you anyway. So tell us how we can support the book and everyone can get their own copy, and let's go from there.
Sure. Well, look, for your audience, I mean, you've heard Eddie speaking for an hour. You've heard how much knowledge he has. This book is like taking Eddie's brain onto a book, basically. Like all the kind of, I think the hardest part has been curating all the products, the thousands of products, into kind of something really focused and really interesting. And I was saying, Colin, when we kind of cut for a sec, that me reading the book, I've learned so much. It's so interesting, the history of Sony. So it's available on Kickstarter. It's up for about 4 weeks. What's the link? I'm sure, Colin, I'll send it over to you if you don't have it. I'll be great.
Yeah, we'll put it in the comments and everything so people can just click right on it.
Awesome, perfect. But no, it's a really cool book, and it just takes Sony going through each decade, the key products, and following it through from 1947 when the company first started all the way to today.
It's awesome. Yeah, I'm just looking at the Kickstarter now, like the mock-ups and just some of the things that they like, the 1983 PSF5 Flamingo record player. It's like, what is this? Yeah. It's just amazing. Dude, I can't wait to see this. I can't wait to read it. I'm definitely going to support this myself. And yeah, this is good stuff. I'm so happy for you guys. Congratulations on finding each other, because I really think this is going to allow you both to really, hit the next, especially for you, Sandeep. I'm so excited for you, because you've done a lot of good stuff for on Kickstarter and proven successes. A lot of people don't come through with the stuff that they say they're going to do, so to do it over and over again and to be reliable, I think that speaks a great deal. And Eddie, I mean, just incredible work on the research, on the depth of knowledge, and keep up the great work. Like, I know it sounds so melodramatic in some way, but like, it really is refreshing to see just something like Obsolete Sony. That's just is what it is. It's not breaking character. It's not trying to do anything weird. It's just like, here's like some really interesting stuff you don't know about. I don't think there's enough of that. And it's for a brand we love. So you guys are going to easily surpass the goal here. And I can't wait to see, what's next. You are very welcome here. I won't keep bothering you guys to come on the show to talk about stuff, but if you ever want to, or if there's another round of things you want to talk about, definitely let me know,
Awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
You're very welcome. I got my white whale. Yay. All right. My friends, thank you again for your time. Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support. We appreciate you on Sacred Symbols Plus, patreon.com/lastdaymedia for early ad-free access, and lastdaymedia.store for merch. Until next time, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Collins Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.